The wedding dress hung in the closet like a ghost, still wrapped in plastic that crinkled whenever Sarah moved through the bedroom. 3 weeks ago, she had been hours away from walking down the aisle. 3 weeks ago, her life had made sense. Now, at 28 years old, she sat on the edge of her bed in a cramped Chicago apartment, staring at the engagement ring she couldn't quite bring herself to take off. The text message from Marcus had been brief. Clinical, even. He had fallen in love with someone else. Her maid of honor, specifically. The wedding was off. He hoped she understood. Sarah had read those words so many times that her phone screen bore the ghost impressions of her fingertips. Understanding was the last thing she felt. Betrayal burned in her chest like acid, mixing with a humiliation so profound it made her physically sick. Her mother called every day, voice dripping with a mixture of pity and disappointment that somehow made everything worse. Her father had gone silent, which was almost more painful. Her friends had divided themselves into camps, some supporting her, others mysteriously unavailable. The life she had carefully constructed, the future she had planned with color-coded calendars and Pinterest boards, had collapsed in a single afternoon. Sarah worked as a marketing consultant, a job that required her to project confidence and control. For 3 weeks, she had maintained that facade at the office, smiling through meetings while dying inside. But today, something had snapped. She had walked out mid-presentation, ignoring her boss's confused calls after her. She had driven home in a daze, packed a single bag, and made a decision that surprised even herself. Her grandmother's letter sat on the nightstand, worn from repeated reading. Grandma Claire had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving Sarah a small property in South Dakota. The Black Hills, specifically. Sarah had never seen it, had barely known it existed. Claire had always been the family eccentric, the woman who had left everything behind in her 30s to live near a Lakota reservation, much to the family's eternal confusion and mild embarrassment. The property had seemed like an irrelevant inheritance, something to deal with eventually. Now, it felt like a lifeline. Sarah looked around her apartment, at the life that no longer fit. The furniture she and Marcus had picked out together. The photographs she had turned face down. The future that had been stolen from her. Her hands trembled as she pulled the engagement ring from her finger and dropped it into a drawer. She wouldn't sell it yet. That felt too final, too much like admitting defeat. But she couldn't wear it anymore. The weight of it had become unbearable. Within an hour, she was in her car, heading west with no real plan beyond escape. The city disappeared behind her, replaced by endless highway and farmland. She drove through the day and into the night, stopping only for gas and coffee, running from the wreckage of her old life. The GPS guided her toward coordinates she had never visited, toward a place that existed only in her grandmother's stories. Dawn was breaking when she finally crossed into South Dakota. The landscape had transformed into something ancient and powerful. The Black Hills rose in the distance, dark against the lightening sky, sacred and mysterious. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, some small crack in the armor of her pain. She was exhausted, heartbroken, and completely lost. But for the first time in 3 weeks, she could breathe without feeling like she was suffocating. The GPS announced her arrival just as the sun fully cleared the horizon. Sarah pulled onto a dirt road that wound through pine trees and granite outcroppings. And there, at the end of the path, sat a small cabin that looked like it had grown from the earth itself. Smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was inside. Sarah's grandmother had been dead for 6 months. Her heart began to pound as she parked the car and stepped out into the cool morning air. The door to the cabin opened, and a man emerged. Tall, dark-haired, with eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully maintained walls. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked like he had been waiting. The man stood in the doorway of the cabin like he belonged there, like he was part of the landscape itself. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her phone in her pocket, a reflex born from too many true crime podcasts and urban anxieties. But something in his posture stopped her from dialing. He wasn't threatening. He was simply present, watching her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way that was both uncomfortable and strangely comforting. "You're Claire's granddaughter," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was deep, carrying the faint accent of someone who spoke another language more naturally than English. "She said you would come eventually. I didn't expect it to be so soon after her passing." Sarah blinked, trying to process this information through the fog of exhaustion and confusion. "Who are you? Why are you in my grandmother's cabin?" "My name is Thomas Black Elk. I'm the chief of the tribal council for the Oglala Lakota. Your grandmother was a friend to our people for over 40 years. I've been maintaining this property since she died, as she asked." He stepped down from the porch, moving with a grace that reminded Sarah of the deer she had seen along the highway. "She told me about you. Said you had her spirit but had forgotten it. Said you would need this place someday." The words struck something deep inside Sarah, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. She had barely known her grandmother, had seen her only a handful of times at family gatherings where Claire had seemed out of place, quiet and otherworldly among the noise of Sarah's ambitious, city-dwelling relatives. The idea that Claire had thought about her, had predicted this moment, felt impossible and yet perfectly right. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "She barely knew me." Thomas's expression softened. "She knew you better than you think. She said you were drowning in a life that wasn't yours, that you needed to remember who you were before the world told you who to be." He paused, studying her face. "She was right, wasn't she?" Sarah wanted to argue, to defend her choices, to explain that she had built a perfectly good life that had simply been destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. But standing there in the morning light with the Black Hills rising behind her and this stranger speaking truth she hadn't admitted to herself, the words wouldn't come. Instead, she started to cry. Not delicate tears, but huge, gasping sobs that came from somewhere primal and unstoppable. Thomas didn't move toward her or offer empty comfort. He simply waited, giving her space to break down without judgment. When the storm finally passed, leaving Sarah exhausted and hollow, he spoke again. "The cabin is yours. I've kept it clean and warm. There's firewood stacked on the side, food in the kitchen. Your grandmother's things are mostly as she left them. Take whatever time you need here. The hills have a way of healing what's broken, if you let them." He turned to leave, and Sarah felt a sudden panic at the thought of being alone. "Wait," she called out. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be here." Thomas looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw a hint of a smile. "You don't need to know. You just need to be. Start with that." He gestured toward the cabin. "There's a path behind the house that leads to a clearing. Your grandmother went there every morning. She said it was where she could hear herself think. Maybe it will help you too." Then he was walking away, disappearing into the trees with the same quiet certainty with which he had appeared. Sarah stood alone in front of the cabin, feeling more vulnerable and exposed than she had in her entire life. The Chicago apartment with its locks and doorman suddenly seemed very far away. Here, there was only wilderness and silence and the overwhelming presence of something larger than herself. She forced herself to move, to climb the porch steps and push open the cabin door. Inside, it was exactly as Thomas had promised. Clean, warm, filled with her grandmother's presence. Books lined the walls, many of them about Lakota history and spirituality. Photographs showed Claire with native people of all ages, her face serene in a way Sarah never remembered seeing during family visits. There was a journal on the kitchen table, left open as if Claire had just stepped away. Sarah approached it slowly, almost afraid to look. The last entry was dated 2 days before Claire died. The handwriting was shaky but still recognizable. "If Sarah comes here," it read, "tell her that broken things can be made whole again. Tell her that the Lakota people taught me this. Tell her that Thomas will show her the way, if she lets him. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't be the grandmother she needed when I was alive, but maybe I can be the guide she needs now that I'm gone." Sarah sank into a chair, the journal clutched in her hands, and felt something shift inside her. She had come here to hide, to lick her wounds, to escape the ruins of her failed wedding and broken heart. But her grandmother had seen something else in this place. A possibility. A transformation. A new beginning that required first becoming broken enough to rebuild differently. The morning sun streamed through the windows, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Sarah felt something other than pain. She felt curious. She felt afraid. She felt, impossibly, a tiny spark of hope. The first week passed in a blur of silence and strangeness. Sarah woke each morning to a quiet so complete it felt like pressure in her ears. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin walls. Just birdsong and wind and the occasional distant sound of something moving through the forest. She found herself listening with an intensity she had never experienced, as if the world was speaking a language she was only beginning to understand. True to Thomas's word, she discovered the path behind the cabin on her second day. It wound through pine trees and over granite outcroppings, climbing steadily until it opened into a clearing that took her breath away. The Black Hills spread before her in every direction, ancient and eternal. She sat on a flat rock and felt the enormity of her own smallness, and somehow that was comforting rather than frightening. Thomas appeared again on the 4th day, arriving in an old pickup truck with groceries she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. She had been surviving on the canned goods Claire had left behind and the protein bars from her emergency road trip supply. He unpacked fresh vegetables, bread, eggs, and meat with an efficiency that suggested this was not an act of charity but simply what was done for neighbors in this place. "You look less like a ghost," he observed, setting the last bag on the kitchen counter. "The hills are working on you." Sarah wanted to bristle at his presumption, but she couldn't deny the truth of it. Something was shifting inside her, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. "I don't know what I'm doing here," she admitted. "I ran away from my life, and now I'm just sitting in the woods crying and staring at mountains." "That's a beginning," Thomas said. "Most people never let themselves break down completely. They patch themselves up with the same broken pieces and wonder why nothing changes." He paused, considering her. "Your grandmother told me you were supposed to marry someone. That it didn't happen. Is that why you came?" The directness of the question should have offended her, but instead, it felt like relief. No one in Chicago had been willing to be so blunt, everyone tiptoeing around her pain like it was a wild animal that might attack if startled. "He left me for my best friend 3 weeks before the wedding," Sarah said, and was surprised to hear her voice steady. "Everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be a lie." Thomas nodded as if this made perfect sense. The Lakota have a saying, "Sometimes you must lose everything to find what cannot be lost." Your grandmother understood this. She came here after her husband betrayed her, did you know that? Left everything behind in Minnesota. Her family thought she had lost her mind. But she told me once that she had finally found it. Sarah stared at him. No one had ever told her this story. Her family spoke of Claire as an eccentric who had made strange choices, but never explained what had driven those choices. She was running away too. At first, maybe. But running away and running toward can look the same until you arrive. Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the hills. She came here broken and angry, just like you. But she stayed to learn. She let the land teach her. She let our people teach her. By the end, she was more Lakota in spirit than some who were born to it. She understood what your world often forgets, that we are not separate from the earth, from each other, from the sacred. That healing comes from remembering our connections, not from perfecting our isolation. His words resonated in places Sarah didn't know were listening. Her entire life in Chicago had been about building walls, professional boundaries, personal brands, carefully curated social circles. She had been so busy constructing herself that she had forgotten to question whether the person she was building was actually who she wanted to be. Marcus's betrayal had hurt so much because it had destroyed the image she had spent years perfecting. But maybe, she was beginning to think, that image had needed destroying. "I don't know how to do what she did," Sarah said quietly. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've always been." Thomas turned back to her, and his eyes held a challenge. "Then stop trying to know. Start trying to listen. There's a ceremony in 3 days. A healing circle for people in the community who are struggling. Your grandmother used to come. You should too." Every instinct Sarah had screamed at her to refuse. She wasn't native. She didn't belong. She would be intruding on something sacred and private. But underneath those fears was something else, a desperate hunger to understand what her grandmother had found here, to touch whatever truth had transformed a broken woman into someone who could look at the world with such peace. "I'll come," she heard herself say. Thomas smiled, really smiled this time, and it transformed his entire face. "Good. Bring tobacco. It's a gift for the elder who will lead the ceremony. I'll pick you up at dawn." He headed for the door, then paused. "And Sarah? Stop checking your phone every 5 minutes. The world you left will still be there if you decide to go back. But you can't hear what this place is trying to tell you if you're still listening to the noise from there." After he left, Sarah looked at her phone, realizing he was right. She had been compulsively checking it, scrolling through social media, reading and rereading the messages from her old life. Marcus had texted twice, asking about wedding deposits. Her mother had called 6 times. Her former boss had sent a stern email about professionalism and responsibility. All of it felt like it was happening to someone else, some woman who existed in a world Sarah was no longer sure she belonged to. She turned off the phone completely, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. The silence that followed was profound. Without the constant digital noise, she could hear the cabin settling around her, the wind in the trees, her own breathing. She picked up her grandmother's journal and began to read from the beginning, hungry now for the story of Claire's transformation, desperate to understand how someone could lose everything and somehow find more than they had ever had before. Dawn came cold and clear, painting the black hills in shades of gold and shadow. Sarah stood on the cabin's porch, clutching the tobacco pouch she had purchased from a small store in town, feeling more nervous than she had before any business presentation. Thomas's truck rumbled up the dirt road right on time, and she climbed in without speaking, sensing that this morning required silence. They drove for 20 minutes deeper into the hills, following roads that barely qualified as such, until they reached a clearing where several vehicles were already parked. A large circular structure made of bent saplings and covered with blankets stood in the center of the space. Smoke rose from a fire pit nearby. People of all ages moved around the area with quiet purpose, preparing for something Sarah couldn't quite understand. "That's a sweat lodge," Thomas explained, seeing her confusion. "It's a purification ceremony. We'll pray, we'll sweat, we'll release what's holding us back. It's not easy, but it's powerful." He hesitated. "If you want to leave at any point, you can. No judgment. This ceremony isn't for everyone." But Sarah had already decided. She had driven halfway across the country, had abandoned her entire life, had cried herself empty multiple times. She wasn't going to back away now from whatever this was. "I'm staying," she said with more confidence than she felt. An elder woman approached them, her face deeply lined but her eyes bright with intelligence and warmth. Thomas introduced her as Helen Two Bears, the spiritual leader who would guide the ceremony. Sarah offered the tobacco with shaking hands, and Helen accepted it with a nod of approval. "Your grandmother was a good friend," Helen said, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "She told me about you. Said you had a warrior's heart but had been taught to fight the wrong battles. Today, you'll learn to fight for yourself, for your spirit. That's the hardest battle of all." They separated then, women going to one side to prepare, men to the other. Sarah was given a simple dress to change into and was led to the lodge by a younger woman named Marie who explained the basic protocol. They would enter in a specific order. They would sit in darkness and heat. An elder would pour water on hot stones, creating steam. They would pray, individually and collectively. They would endure. "Why the darkness and heat?" Sarah asked, trying to understand. Marie smiled. "In the womb, we were in darkness and warmth. This is a rebirth. You go in carrying everything that hurts you, everything that's broken. You pray it away. You sweat it out. You let the earth take it back. And when you emerge, you're new again. Clean." The concept seemed both beautiful and terrifying. Sarah had spent her entire adult life trying to stay clean, to maintain control, to present a polished surface to the world. The idea of deliberately breaking down, of exposing her rawest self in front of strangers, violated everything she had been taught about self-protection and dignity. But she crawled into the lodge when her turn came, taking her place in the circle with the other women. The darkness was absolute when the flap closed behind the last person. Then the stones came, glowing red in the blackness, and the heat began. Water hissed on rocks, and steam filled the space, making breathing an act of will. The elder's voice rose in prayer, first in Lakota, then in English, asking for healing, for strength, for the courage to release what needed releasing. They went around the circle, each woman speaking her pain into the darkness. Addiction. Abuse. Loss. Grief. Stories poured out like water, like blood, raw and sacred. When it came to Sarah's turn, she felt her throat close with panic. But in the darkness, with the heat stripping away every defense, the truth came anyway. "I thought I knew who I was," she whispered. "I thought I had built a good life. But the man I loved betrayed me, and it destroyed everything. And the worst part is, I'm not even sure I loved him. I think I loved the idea of who I was supposed to be. I think I've been performing my own life instead of living it. And now I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know who I am without the role I was playing." The admission hung in the steam-thick air. Then Helen's voice came from somewhere in the darkness, gentle but firm. "The false self dies hard. It fights. It tells you that without it, you're nothing. But that's the lie. Beneath the false self is your true self, the one you were born with, the one the Creator made. That self has been waiting for you to come home. Let the false one burn away in this heat. Let it die. Something true wants to be born." More water hit the stones. The heat became almost unbearable. Sarah felt like she was dissolving, like everything solid about her was turning to liquid and steam. She cried, but couldn't tell her tears from the sweat that poured from every part of her body. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in, begging for clarity, for direction, for some sign that this suffering had meaning. And then, in the midst of the heat and darkness and desperation, something shifted. The pain in her chest that had been her constant companion for 3 weeks suddenly changed quality. It was still there, but it felt different. Not like an injury but like a birth. Something inside her was cracking open, and instead of fear, she felt a strange, wild relief. The woman who had driven here from Chicago, who had defined herself by her job title and relationship status and carefully constructed image, was dying in this heat. And beneath her, someone else was stirring, someone more ancient and essential, someone who had been buried under years of expectations and performances. When they finally emerged from the lodge, crawling out into the cool morning air, Sarah felt raw and new, like a creature without skin. The world looked different, sharper, more vivid, more real. Thomas was there, having gone through his own ceremony with the men, and when their eyes met, something passed between them that required no words. They had both been to the same place, had both touched the same truth. Helen approached Sarah with a blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders with a grandmother's tenderness. "You did well," she said. "The hard part is living what you learned in there." The ceremony opened a door. Now you have to choose whether to walk through it. She paused, studying Sarah's face. Your grandmother walked through her door and never looked back. The question is, will you have the same courage? The weeks following the ceremony passed differently than the ones before. Sarah fell into a rhythm dictated by the land rather than by schedules and notifications. She woke with the sun and walked the trail to the clearing, sitting in meditation as her grandmother had done. She read voraciously from Claire's extensive library, absorbing books about Lakota spirituality, about people who had remade their lives, about the difference between existing and truly living. Thomas became a regular presence, appearing every few days with supplies, with invitations to community events, with stories about her grandmother's time in the hills. She learned that Claire had taught English at the reservation school, had organized cultural exchanges, had become so beloved that hundreds had attended her funeral, a funeral Sarah had skipped because of a work deadline she could no longer even remember. The shame of that realization cut deep. While she had been obsessing over marketing campaigns and Instagram likes, her grandmother had been building a real legacy, touching real lives, becoming the person she was meant to be. Sarah had spent years chasing a version of success that now seemed hollow and meaningless. But Thomas didn't let her wallow in regret. "You're not your grandmother," he said one afternoon as they sat on the cabin's porch watching the sun set over the hills. "You don't have to follow her exact path. But you do have to find your own. That's the work now. Figuring out what you actually want, not what you think you should want." It was a question Sarah had never really asked herself. From college onward, she had followed a prescribed path. Good job, serious relationship, marriage, house, kids, retirement. Check the boxes, climb the ladder, achieve the markers of success. But sitting here in the quiet with the hills watching, that path looked like a prison sentence rather than a life plan. "What if I don't know what I want?" she asked. Thomas smiled. "Then you're finally being honest. Most people are so busy pretending they know that they never stop to actually figure it out." He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What did you love doing before the world told you what you should do? Before grades and jobs and expectations?" Sarah had to reach back into childhood to find the answer. "I used to write," she said slowly. "Stories, mostly. I filled notebooks with them. I wanted to be a novelist, to tell stories that mattered. But my parents said that wasn't realistic, that I needed a practical career. So I went into marketing, which is basically writing, but soulless and in service to selling things I don't care about." "So write," Thomas said simply. "Your grandmother's cabin, this land, this quiet, it's all yours now. Use it. Stop performing your life and start living it." The suggestion was so obvious and yet so revolutionary that Sarah almost laughed. But the idea took root, and the next morning she dug out an old laptop from her car and began to write. Not marketing copy, not social media posts, but the story that had been growing inside her since the ceremony. The story of a woman who lost everything and found herself. Fiction, but not really. The truth, but disguised. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. 4 hours each day, she wrote with an intensity that felt almost spiritual. The cabin became a sanctuary, the keyboard a prayer device. She wrote about betrayal and survival, about false selves dying and true selves being born, about the difference between the life you're supposed to want and the life your soul actually needs. Thomas read the pages as they accumulated, and his feedback was brutally honest and deeply respectful. He pointed out where her city prejudices showed, where she had romanticized or misunderstood native culture, where her own pain had made her writing self-indulgent. She revised and improved, learning to see more clearly, to feel more honestly, to write with truth rather than with wish fulfillment. 6 weeks after arriving at the cabin, Sarah received a call from Marcus. She had turned her phone back on for emergencies, had been monitoring it sporadically. His voice sounded strange through the speaker, like something from another lifetime. "Sarah, we need to talk about the apartment," he said. "And I wanted to apologize properly, in person. Can you come back? We miss you." The plural was a knife. We. Him and Jenna, her former best friend, now living the life that was supposed to be Sarah's. The old Sarah would have crumbled at this, would have either raged or wept or both. But the woman sitting on the cabin's porch, looking at the hill she had come to love, felt something different. She felt pity. And distance. And a certainty that surprised her. "I'm not coming back, Marcus," she said calmly. "Sell the apartment, keep whatever you want from it. I don't need those things anymore. And you don't need to apologize. You did me a favor. You freed me from a life that was killing me slowly. So thank you, actually. I hope you're happy." She hung up before he could respond, and realized her hands weren't shaking. Her heart wasn't racing. The man who had shattered her world now had no power over her at all. The broken vows that had driven her here had become the foundation of a new beginning. That evening, Thomas arrived with Helen 2 bears. They had news. The reservation school was looking for someone to teach creative writing and literature, a position that had been vacant since Claire died. The pay was modest, the work would be challenging, but it was real work, meaningful work, the kind that changed lives rather than selling products. "Your grandmother held this position for 30 years, Helen said. "Would like you to consider taking it. Not because you're Claire's granddaughter, but because Thomas has shared your writing and we believe you have something valuable to offer. You understand what it means to lose yourself and fight to become real again. That's what we want our young people to learn, how to be themselves in a world that constantly tells them to be something else." Sarah looked between them, at these people who had become family in the space of weeks, at the opportunity to step into her grandmother's footsteps while making her own path. Behind her, the cabin waited, full of Claire's wisdom and Sarah's emerging new life. Before her, the hills stretched endlessly, holding space for transformation, for healing, for becoming. The old Sarah would have made a pros and cons list, would have consulted friends and family, would have worried endlessly about making the right choice. But the woman who had been reborn in the sweat lodge, who had let her false self die in the heat and darkness, knew the answer immediately. It wasn't even a choice. It was a recognition of what had already become true. "I'll take it," she said. "When do I start?" Thomas's smile was like sunrise. "Tomorrow, if you want. There's a classroom waiting. Students waiting. A life waiting." That night, Sarah sat at her grandmother's desk and wrote in the journal that Claire had left for her. "Dear Grandma," she wrote, "I understand now. You didn't run away. You ran toward truth, toward yourself, toward the life your soul needed to live. I'm doing the same now. Thank you for showing me the way. Thank you for saving me by teaching me to save myself. The vows I made to Marcus are broken, but I'm making new vows now. To live honestly. To write truthfully. To honor the gift of this second chance. I think you'd be proud. I hope you're watching. I finally came home." Outside, the Black Hills stood eternal under a sky full of stars, holding space for all the broken people who came seeking healing, for all the false selves that needed to die, for all the true selves waiting to be born. Sarah closed the journal, turned off the light, and fell asleep feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but something better. Peace. Purpose. The profound rightness of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The Lakota Chief hadn't saved her. The ceremony hadn't saved her. The hills hadn't saved her. They had simply shown her how to save herself. And that, she was learning, made all the difference.